I'm Ceyla Pazarbaşoğlu, the Director of Strategy Policy Review here at the IMF, and I am very pleased to have this conversation with Martin Wolf, who is the Chief Economics Commentator at Financial Times. It's great to have you here, Martin. We had a great conversation a few years back. I'm going to refer to it. But today we have basically 45 minutes. We're going to talk about three topics which are interlinked. First, we will talk a little bit about the global environment and the financing challenges. Then we will focus on debt vulnerabilities. And then thirdly, we will talk about what to do about it, what policies should be in place, what have been done already, and what needs to be thought through going forward. So back in July 2020, we had a conversation, Martin, if you remember. At that time, it was in the thick of COVID pandemic, and we talked about a colossal storm, and we both talked about how are we going to emerge in 2-3 years' time. And it's about that time, and we can discuss what has happened in the interim. So it's about 3 years since we had our discussion, and I have 4 observations which I want to mention, and then would love to hear your views. First of all, despite our major concerns, the world economy remained remarkably resilient, despite all the shocks that we went through, pandemic, wars, and many other issues, inflation, of course, top of mind for us lately. But despite that, labor markets held up, supply chains became more resilient, supply side developments are now more favorable, and what we have is central banks really trying to bring down inflation, and that has been relatively successful, and we hope that we will have a soft landing. So on the world economy side, it has been very resilient. But still, we have about 3% global growth, well below the average of 3.8% of the last decades, and that, of course, have implications for divergences both within countries and across countries. So that's a key challenge, and would like to talk about that. Third, at that talk, you suggested a few things, and I wanted to briefly mention them because we have made progress. You at the time said that it would be very appropriate to have a large allocation of SDRs, and we did have the largest ever allocation of 650 billion of special drawing rights in August 2021. That was very important to support countries in terms of reserves, and for those that needed to channel those into expenditures, that has been very helpful. We have it all on our website as to how the SDRs have been allocated and so on. You also talked about channeling the SDRs that advanced economies or those with strong positions hold, and that has also been the case. We have about 46 billion SDRs that have been, $46 billion that have been allocated to our Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, which is lending to low-income countries, concessional lending, and $40 billion to our most recent instrument, Resilience and Sustainability Facility, for addressing structural challenges like climate change. And then finally, last December, IMF Board of Governors approved a 50% increase in members' quotas, and that is, of course, a major achievement in terms of making the fund much more quota-based institution. So those were issues that we discussed, and I'm happy to report that we have made progress. But we also talked a lot about financial fragilities, and that we were worried about emerging markets and low-income countries, especially with limited fiscal space and scarring for those countries. I remember we both talked about potential defaults, and you did say you expect a lot of defaults. But on that one, I think also some positive and some negative news, in the sense that we have not, majority of the emerging markets, especially some of the larger ones, have shown a lot of resilience. And I think that reflects the fact that many of these countries have improved their institutional framework, central bank credibility, policy making, both in terms of foreign exchange reserve accumulation, inflation targeting regimes, fiscal rules, and so on. So some of the major emerging market countries have actually remained very resilient, and I think that has been very important in terms of not having a systemic debt crisis or any systemic crisis of the magnitudes we saw in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So that's the good news. Of course, we have many challenges ahead. You have a recent piece in the Financial Times, which I thought was excellent, looking at drivers, risks, shocks, fragilities, and so on. And it would be really good to hear from you your views on how you see the global environment, what that means in terms of the second topic we will talk about, which is debt in emerging markets and developing economies. So over to you, Martin. Your thoughts on where we are and what is facing us going forward.
So first of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you again, and I'm looking forward very much to this topic, discussion of this topic, though I would guess my knowledge of what's going on with the debt of developing countries, emerging and developing countries, is probably significantly smaller than that, not only of you, but of everybody who is listening to this. So you can now switch off. But anyway, let me dare to address your questions and points. First, I think it is clearly true and important that we came out at a global level from the pandemic and subsequent shocks less painfully than I and quite a few others, I think, at that time expected. And that's partly because a pandemic of this kind, in the current context, in the context of the world of today, clearly has ramifications which we'd never experienced before, certainly nobody living. And so we really didn't know what would happen. And another crucial fact is we got on top of the pandemic, and the pandemic itself became less lethal, the two together, much more quickly than we feared at that time. And that helped, obviously, enormously to get back to something more normal. Though I would, and this is the final comment on that, note that it's pretty clear that there has been very significant divergence in performance and in the ability of countries to get back on track. That's true among developed countries. It's also with the US doing particularly well and the others doing less well, and it's also clearly true among emerging and developing countries. So there's a lot of divergence. And finally, as you note, the average rate of growth is slowing. I think there are very powerful reasons for that in demography worldwide, and very significantly in the dramatic slowdown of China, which is, I think, a very important factor. So you asked me a little bit about my perception of the world as it is now. I went at this, as I think you note, in a rather unorthodox way. I don't believe we can forecast the world, even in the short run, let alone the long run. But we can think about things we do know and things we can think about the risks in the system and the fragilities in the system, which are, of course, different things. I've started by focusing on the things that we really do know to a very high order, not certainly, but pretty clearly. We know, for example, demographic changes, which are going to be a very powerful factor in the world over the next decades. We know about the climate problem and the obvious fact that it seems it's absolutely inconceivable that the climate problems won't get worse, in at least over the next decade or so. And some of this could be very significant. We know that there are rapid technological advances occurring. That's obviously true with artificial intelligence, but also in renewable energy, in energy systems more broadly. We're going to have some very profound changes in our world. We know that the know-how that was developed first in current advanced countries, now increasingly in emerging countries, is going to spread across the world, and we need it to. It's very important, and we know with some precision that it would be extraordinary if growth itself didn't continue. As you rightly say, the growth rate has slowed. That's pretty clear, but it is also clear that it is likely to continue. And these are very, very powerful factors. Now, if we think about where the world is now, going from these driving forces and not talking about the recent past any further, I think the crucial point to make is first that we have indeed gone through a whole slew of shocks, and I think of shocks as realized risks. And the number of risks we have out there that we can list is incredibly long, and we can't predict when they're going to actually realize. But what's been extraordinary about the last few years is how many of these risks have realized. Pandemic, 2 wars. Is that the end of it, or are we going to have lots more? We just don't know. We simply don't know. But we do, I think, know, and sort of second point on this, that if nothing terrible happens, that it looks as though we're getting on top of inflation. And that is because policy has genuinely improved across much of the world, and to the extent it hasn't in the high-income countries, they've got on top of it reasonably well. And I'm pretty confident that unless there's some terrible shock, that we are going to see inflation fall back to target pretty firmly. And I expect that to lead to lower interest rates this year. I know the fund is on the last mile is the hardest sort of thing, but I think that there's a very good chance we're going to see lower interest rates. And I'm also rather confident, we can discuss this further, which is relevant to this issue, that if that's the case, that it may well be that interest rates will actually go back more to the sort of level they were before this shock, than to much higher levels, as many have tended to assume, that these high interest rates might actually be a blip. And then I indicate some of the big fragilities in the system. I go back to the debt issue, and that is, of course, very much linked to what happens to interest rates and growth. So if you're moderately optimistic about growth and as optimistic as I am about interest rates, the debt problems, debt problems may turn out to be manageable. There's a huge set of questions about domestic politics and domestic political stability, particularly for the democracies, with exceptional number of very important elections this year. And then finally, there's these huge geopolitical questions. And again, I feel a bit optimistic about this. It seems to me one of the things that emerged from the last year, 8 months, and very much in Davos, that the US and China, at least, are working very, very hard to bring their friction under control and to contain the hostility and contain the potential catastrophic effects on globalization, on trade, and all the rest of it. And indeed, I wrote a recent piece, which also came out last week, arguing that while hyperglobalization is certainly dead, I think it's overwhelmingly probable, not certain, that globalization, that is to say, highly integrated world economies, will endure, barring some terrible catastrophe of war among great powers more serious than what we're seeing now. So this is a high-risk world, highly uncertain world. There's no way around that. But I think there the fact that we're getting a control of inflation, the fact that we are seeing a really big attempt by the US and China to put their relationship on a more stable basis to avoid terrible mistakes. These are, in the broad picture, moderately encouraging features. But, and the very last comment, I don't believe we're going to go back to the growth rates we saw in the earlier part of this century, unless something very, very big happens. For example, India starts growing in the way that China used to grow. But otherwise, I'm a bit more optimistic now than when we spoke last, and significantly more optimistic, I think, than I was a year or two ago.
That's great. I hope if when we have the next conversation in a few years, we don't look back and say, well, we were a bit too optimistic, because it's,
so do I.
You know, we really seem to be going in circles. Let's talk about debt. So global public debt is at record levels. It's comparable only to World War II. So not only public debt, but also private debt is at very high levels. And it is a contingent liability. We've all seen private debt end up being on the public balance sheet. I know my own country in Turkey. I worked there during the crisis years after 2001. We had debt to GDP 30%. Almost overnight, it jumped to 90%. Of course, it has links to the needed devaluation and the adjustment and so on. But it was also a lot of debt that was hidden and was actually made transparent with the reform. So there are contingent liabilities, there are concerns about that transparency, and with different actors, different private sector, public sector actors. So that's a second point, that we have not only very high public sector debt, but also very high private sector debt. And then third point is what you also talked about. We have seen central banks being key drivers of the secular decline in interest rates, along with, of course, low productivity and low growth rates. But that's changing. How much, how permanent this will be, how persistent this will be, remains to be seen. But I think we could say that the outlook is now for relatively higher and more volatile interest rates going forward, precisely because of all the issues that you mentioned. So that's a key concern for us, that servicing costs, and that has implications to the extent that you have the real interest rate and real growth differential not conducive to debt reduction for some countries. That, of course, worries us. For emerging market countries, the median external debt service is now almost 50% higher at 11% of revenues compared to 8% in about 10 years ago. For low-income countries, it's actually much higher. It's about 2.5 times higher than just a decade ago. 14% of revenues, excluding grants, go to financing debt service. That's compared to 6% in 2013. So we have seen a sharp increase in debt servicing costs, both for emerging markets and low-income countries. Of course, there are differences across countries. I'm just talking about the median. Now, we actually just published some research, a blog today, which looks at the median, the differences across countries, and we do a lot of work in trying to understand country by country the developments and how we can best support them. Fourthly, we see a big change in terms of the creditor landscape. We used to have, for a lot of the emerging markets and low-income countries, it used to be what we call the Paris Club, the official creditors, as well as some of the advanced economies, as well as multilateral debt. Now you see much higher share of private sector debt, private creditors that are holding external debt of course, emerging market countries, but also low-income countries. You see in 10 years, for low-income countries, private credit debt private creditors' position jumped from 11 to 28% of total debt. So you do see major changes in terms of the creditor landscape. So what does that mean? That has implications, of course, as to how countries can use their revenues, fiscal revenues, what expenditures they can take on in terms of anything from capital investment to health, education, development needs, as well as other needs compared to servicing debt. So I think that's a key concern that we have now, which is more so than solvency. We haven't seen any, and knock on wood, we had last one that asked for debt restructuring was Ghana about a year ago. I think it's good that we have made some progress. We'll come to this as we discuss policies and approaches that we are taking as the global community in terms of resolving debt issues. But the point is, we haven't seen major solvency problems, neither in most of the emerging market countries and also in major low-income countries. That said, the key concern is the liquidity issues. There are major financing needs that these countries face. You know, we talked about health, education, and so on, let alone climate finance, the climate transition, and they have limited fiscal space, and that fiscal space has been declining due to high debt servicing costs. So that's the key issue ahead of us. It doesn't affect all countries across the board, of course. We have to be careful. It's more of a problem in some of the countries. But I wanted to ask you your views on this issue of debt and increasing debt servicing burdens.
Well, these are fascinating and important questions. So let's just start with the nature of the debt positions and how they should be measured. You talked about public and private, rightly. I think it is important to remember, because it bears essentially on fiscal flexibility or fiscal space everywhere, but certainly in high-income countries, that they have what I think of as implicit debt, which are commitments we don't normally include in public debt, namely commitments to pay pensions, pensions of their own employees, pensions, national pensions more generally, and in practice, the commitments to pay a whole slew of welfare payments, health, education, family support, and so forth. And this isn't, of course, now just in high-income countries. Some form of welfare state has been put in place in many other countries, rightly by and large, and cutting those expenditures is immensely costly, not just politically, which is obvious, but also in terms of the impact on the functioning of society, on the human capital, the whole basis on which countries can grow. And this is related to my reaction to this question of insolvency versus illiquidity. So, in other words, when is debt a problem, and how is it a problem? I tend to feel that when we're talking about private corporations, or even perhaps private individuals, we can make this distinction with some clarity. But when we're talking about states, the distinction between insolvency and illiquidity is essentially a political one, not an economic one, in the sense that, in some sense, it is usually, almost always possible, in some theoretical sense, for a country to continue to serve its debt if it sacrifices enough else. I mean, it is possible for a country, if it's run sufficiently ruthlessly, and they have frequently been in the past, by their own governments or occupying powers, God forbid, to extract the resources needed to make their debt whole. But if the price of doing so you could say this country looks solvent, it can service its debts. But if the price of doing so is to put a merciless squeeze on the welfare of the public, of the growth potential of the country, on the services on which people rightly depend, and in poor countries that's at a very low level, then the consequences will show not in default, but in miserable economic performance and worse, terrible suffering, human suffering. And I've been very struck in one of my columns since I don't follow this regularly, but one statistic, which is that in low-income countries, the number of people who are below the absolute poverty level or the extreme poverty level, I don't know what you would now call it, has ceased to fall. After a long period when we had a stupendous success in reducing the number of extremely poor people relative to the world's population, this has sort of stopped. That's very, very depressing. And if we are making debt whole by sacrificing countries in this way, then I would consider this a miserable failure. So to me, the interesting or important question is not whether these countries can service their debts, because in some sense, if you're sufficiently determined and the creditors are sufficiently ruthless, they can, but what is the cost in terms of development prospects and human welfare of their being required to do, or feeling that they are obliged, and perhaps rightly obliged, to do so, rightly obliged in the sense that the cost of default will be so terrible. But I am concerned that there's a lot of hidden suffering here, which is not just short-term but long-term, and that would make the solvency come at a very, very, very high price. And that comes to sort of the big issues. I think you're absolutely right. Some very good things happened. The agreement on the SDRs, attempts to manage debt, common framework, and so forth. The new quota increases. There's a lot of discussion now, the possibility of capital increases for the multilateral development banks. But I would say that far too little of the SDRs did end up with poor countries, that the impact of higher interest rates upon them is very disturbing, and after all, they didn't cause any of the problems that they are now suffering from, particularly the inflation problem. They are the victims of the terms of trade shocks which followed from some of these crises. I think that, I won't go into more detail, I am very concerned that there is sort of hidden suffering, not very hidden suffering, among hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, in fact far more than that, and making the financial sector system whole is, to my mind, less important than resolving that problem. I've tended to have rather radical views of debt for quite a long time. And I do feel that if a lot of really poor countries are feeling obliged to go to the private markets, given the well-known problems with those markets, the illiquidity problem that you mentioned, and the consequence of that, we really haven't been doing enough to provide the resources that are needed to make development successful across the entire world.
Yep. Yeah, for us, of course, we have been supporting countries. You mentioned the SDRs. Yes, in terms of the general allocation, a lower percentage went to the developing countries. But at the same time, it was quite crucial for many of them, especially during the pandemic. And as I said, we do track this, and we have it in our internet as to how countries have utilized the general allocation of the SDRs. But more importantly, there has been close to 100 billion now rechanneling of SDRs, special drawing rights, by some of the stronger countries with stronger external positions, which then gets unlent to some of the low-income countries that are in need. That said, some of those countries really need grants, because at the end of the day, IMF is a senior creditor, right? So they do need grants, and I think that's very important, as we do see decline in official development assistance, and that's the whole discussion about the reform of the multilateral development banks, our sister institution, and other MDBs, which is really critical for the low-income countries to be able to address the challenges ahead. And you mentioned all the issues, the fiscal needs of advanced economies, or the fiscal commitments of advanced economies. We have been talking about this. There was a very good op-ed by our first deputy managing director, Gita, on the fiscal risks, because these have been piling up. We have, in addition to what you mentioned, climate spending, other spending, entitlements, the social safety nets, and so on, but also a large increase in defense expenditures, right? So there is, advanced economies have been increasing also their fiscal spending, and that means there is a competition for financing. There is only limited pot of resources, and if advanced economies are increasing green investments at very favorable returns, that will make it much more difficult for emerging markets and low-income countries going forward to tap those resources. So I think we have legitimate concerns about what you said, the hidden suffering, but more broadly about meeting some of these challenges, global public goods that are really critical to mitigate the risks to all countries. So I think this is an issue that really requires thinking as to what kind of policies should be in place. And I think this is a good segue to the last part of our discussion. So what do we do about it? So several thoughts on this one. First, what countries themselves should be doing more of. And this is the whole work on domestic resource mobilization. We have been working on this for decades now, but now there's a real push by us and our sister institution, the World Bank, to support countries as they increase tax efficiency. There's a lot of room to make improvements here. Some of the countries' domestic revenues are tax revenues, for example, to GDP are at the low teens compared to what they should be aspiring to. So there is scope for increasing tax efficiency, dealing with tax loopholes, putting in place new taxes, and that's, of course, a lot of country-specific work, which our colleagues who provide capacity development technical assistance to countries are working on. Fiscal rules, strong fiscal frameworks, this is all developing local capital markets, local currency markets. This is all part of this very important agenda, which I think the countries should really put a lot of effort into improving. That said, this takes time. It's a difficult set of reforms. They don't happen overnight. And we have this problem of short to medium term needs that countries have. And that brings the question of, should there be a package? So countries do the reforms, multilaterals, IMF, multilateral development banks, scale up financing, official development support to countries that need that, and then, of course, the private sector contributing to this as private creditors, rather, contributing to this package of measures. In that context, in terms of how the private sector contributed so far, during the pandemic, rather, we did have the debt service suspension initiative that we introduced together with the World Bank. The G20 adopted it. It helped the countries with the low-income countries which did not have access to markets. I think that was a good development. There was important contributions by countries, official creditors, especially China, but also others. And then the G20 with concerns about, okay, that was dealing with liquidity problems. It was actually not forgiving debt, but rather suspending the debt service. Was the common framework for dealing with debt issues was put in place. It has made progress. It has been slow. It has to be more predictable. We have been talking about this for several years now. It needs to be more predictable, more timely, also include emerging market countries. So I think common framework provides a very important way of bringing official creditors and private creditors around the table to support countries that do need to restructure their debt. So good progress there, but much more needs to be done. We have established together with the World Bank and the G20 presidency at the time last year, India, the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, which is a way of bringing it's the first time of bringing the private sector, the borrowing countries, the creditor countries, as well as the official multilateral lenders all together to discuss what are impediments, how can we reach common shared understanding on bottlenecks to debt restructuring. So that has been successful in making progress and reaching understandings on some of the issues, but much more needs to be done. The GSDR has a whole work agenda, and of course common framework. We have seen some progress in terms of reaching debt agreements. That the time has reduced quite substantially, but still it needs to be faster, more predictable, and include a broader set of countries so that countries don't wait at the last minute to come and ask for such measures. So I think there is some progress, but the question is, do we need something further? Do we need there's some proposals out there now, a much broader debt for climate swaps, for example, for not just low-income countries, but also middle-income countries. So do we need a more systemic approach? We think at the fund that we're looking at these issues case by case is important. Piloting some of these platform type approaches will be very important going forward. So in our view, we are not yet there to need some sort of a systemic approach that was used in the past, the Brady, the HIPIC. We had the Vienna Initiative after the global financial crisis. But we are monitoring the developments very carefully to make sure that we are prepared in case such approaches would be necessary. So it would be good to hear from you as to what you think has been successful, useful, and what more needs to be done going forward to address some of the issues that we discussed. As
you indicate, these are very complicated issues. I was just going to comment. I made this point, I think, if I remember correctly, at a panel I moderated in Marrakesh, just to show that nothing really changes. That I joined the World Bank as a young professional. I hesitate to admit this, in the early 1970s, and the division I joined was the domestic finance division, and its entire focus was on resource mobilization. So this indicates that this is something that people in the development world have been thinking about since they started thinking about development. In fact, it's very clear that when people started thinking about this right at the beginning, this question of how you mobilize resources was central. In handling international debt issues, if it's national currency, different questions arise. But if it's international debt, international borrowing in foreign currencies in foreign locations, be it private or official, there's obviously always a problem, which, broadly speaking, the moral hazard problem, which is that countries don't want to default because it will, they fear, rightly certainly to some degree, that it will make it far more difficult for them to borrow in future and damage their reputation. So they're prepared to sacrifice a great deal to avoid that, which comes back to this question I indicated earlier. So it seems to me, coming back to why there have been fewer defaults than I've expected, well, one reason, it's clear that countries are working incredibly hard to avoid being driven into that situation. On the other hand, we have bankruptcy procedures in our domestic law, despite this concern, which was, of course, constantly mentioned in the 19th century when we introduced these sorts of concepts for individuals and corporations and businesses, because sometimes it's socially necessary to adjust obligations to the reality of the position of countries. I tend to think, but this is a real judgment, that in general we take too long to deal with debt preemptively, as it were. We allow it to burden poor countries too long, and then they can very easily get into a vicious circle, which is that, yes, they meet their obligations, but at enormous cost. The cost is visible to outsiders. They can see there's tremendous pressure on the government not to continue to do this. This affects then the terms on which they can roll over debt, the terms on which they can incur new debt, and they get into a vicious spiral, which basically constrains development for a very long time. So I'm inclined to the view that the moral hazard concern, if you like, that way of thinking about it proves too binding, and that's why I was persuaded decades ago, and it was a bit against my initial wishes, that the HIPC initiative was very important, and we fully supported it here at the paper. I don't know the details of the situation now, but it seems to me that we do need ways, reasonably proactively, to say, well, this is a country in a situation which maybe to some extent is its fault, but of course a lot of it is due to external circumstances of which they had no control. And in that situation, we need mechanisms which will sort out balance sheets relatively quickly. And that's again why I thought the Brady Plan was very good, and it came many years too late, and the result was a lost decade, which I also wrote this is the disadvantage of being very old, is I remember these debates and I was involved in them, and I thought, well, it was pretty obvious pretty early in this process, and I had huge arguments with some friends of mine, I won't mention their name, that the Latin American countries' debts were unsustainable and they needed to be reduced dramatically, and it took nearly 10 years, 8 or 9 years before we got to that stage. I hope very much, without going into the details, we don't make that mistake again with some of the poorest countries in the world. So that's, as it were, cleaning up the balance sheet from the past mistakes. Then we have the question, of course, about the future. So we've learned something about the nature of the world, the uncertainties and unpredictabilities. I would very strongly support your view that we need more grants. Particularly for the poorest countries, to be able to make sure that they don't suffer a lost decade, and I think we can clearly afford this. The monies involved are actually not very large for the developed countries when I look at, and indeed some of the larger emerging countries, the big ones, China, for example, and we should have more grants. We need also more capital for the multilateral development bank, so we need to use that capital more effectively to increase the flow of resources. And this then goes to my talked about the bankruptcy process or the bankruptcy regime. I talked about the grants and flow of resources, and this is the third point: your debt for climate swaps. It seems to me now we recognize two sorts of reasons for increasing resource flows to emerging and developing countries. The first is, of course, that We are pretty close, but we haven't got to the elimination of extreme poverty from the world. I won't go into the details about what all that means, but I think we should do it, and we should do it now. It's gone on long enough, and we should put countries into the position that they can at least give their peoples what we would have to regard as minimally satisfactory standard of living. The world can afford it, and we should do it. I feel very strongly about that, and we made so much progress. We should finish it, and this means more. I think that we need more than that, but that's a necessary condition. I won't go into the Sustainable Development Goals and all that. And the other reason is there are public goods here, global public goods. Yep. We all recognize now that the global environment is a massive global public good. So I think is peace and stability in these countries, the avoidance of war, the avoidance of disturbances which will create tremendous migration flows and all the rest of it. We have an interest in ensuring Africa in particular, but not just Africa, developed successfully. Mm-hmm. And I think a big initiative on what you call debt for climate or debt for development or whatever is a part of what we should be thinking about. We shouldn't accept, and this is sort of that's why I went to work with the World Bank in the first place, we shouldn't accept the persistence of extreme poverty in our world and the failure to help people to adjust to, adapt to, and exploit the technological advances associated with climate threats and climate opportunities. And I think we must do this as a global community. So I would like us to see all this, what we're rightly discussing now, as part of a global agreement on what our moral and practical obligations are to one another in what is pretty obviously one world. And if climate doesn't tell us that, what does? So I think a bit of idealism is necessary too here, along with all the pragmatism. And I don't think we should allow these debt problems, which I think are to a significant degree concealed in the way I've suggested, to fester for a decade.
Great. We are already I think we already ran out of time. This was a great discussion, Martin. The last point I will make is the countries that have made progress in reducing debt very substantially, there are 4 or 5 of them, and like you said, they all come late. And the 2 key drivers of this, why they have been successful, is one, that they have put in place very strong fiscal frameworks, transparent fiscal rules, and therefore credibility. And really, Jamaica is a good example, Ireland, Iceland, Barbados, Turkey in the 2000s, but all of them unfortunately came right after a crisis, so I hope countries act more preemptively. And the second point is they were successful because there was political solidarity. There was an agreement by all stakeholders in the country and ownership in dealing with these issues and taking the reform. So I do hope that we will get these 2 preconditions and preemptively address the issues, and I'm sure we will continue our discussion and hopefully with even more optimism next time around. Thank you so much, and to everyone for joining us, and have a nice day, evening, wherever your time, whatever time it is in where you are. Thanks again.
Great pleasure to be with you.